The book I chose to read this summer is called Looking for Alaska, and it was written by best-selling author John Green. I chose to read this novel because I'd been eyeing it for a while before this class, but I never picked it up. When banned books first started their buzz on social media, Looking for Alaska was the first one that I'd ever heard of. I wasn't fully aware of what the concept around a banned book was before this, so that was really interesting to learn. On top of that, I'm a big John Green fan. Two of my favorite books are The Fault in Our Stars and Paper Towns. So when I saw that this novel was one of our choices to read in this class, I knew I had to do it. The novel surrounds three main characters, the first one being Miles, also called Pudge, who leaves his hometown in hopes of finding what he calls the Great Perhaps. He's a shy, sheltered teenager who was bullied in middle school and didn't make very many friends after that. His father had attended a boarding school when he was younger and made the suggestion that Miles should do the same. Desperate for change, Miles arrives at his new school seeking to change his narrative and become more adventurous. Upon arrival, he meets his new roommate, Chip, who is mostly mentioned in the book under the name The Colonel. He's a junior at the boarding school and is exactly the opposite of our main character. He's defiant and risky, but the two ultimately become the best of friends. The character development between these two was one of my favorite parts of the novel. Together they had to navigate love, loss, and a whole lot in between. The Colonel's the character who introduces the concept of the boarding school's social status to Miles. The Colonel explains that there are two groups, the regular boarders, like himself, and the weekday warriors. Those are the kids who technically go to the boarding school, but are far richer than the rest, and go home to their mansions nearby every weekend. The two groups go back and forth with pranking each other, and are pinned against each other for the majority of the novel. The final character, and arguably the most important, is Alaska. She's the only character who isn't given a nickname, but it actually fits her not to have one. Throughout the book, she is so unapologetically herself that no nickname fits her better than her real one. From their very first meeting, Miles is captivated by Alaska's energy. She is a fearless, fun, and rebellious teen. Also, the opposite of Miles. This is what makes their friendship so interesting, though. Miles seems to keep Alaska grounded, and Alaska reminds Miles to live a little. As previously mentioned, the basic plot of the story revolves around Miles seeking the Great Perhaps. This ultimately means he wants a life greater than what he is getting while living at his parents' house. So he packs up all his stuff and sets out to boarding school. Upon arrival, he finds himself fitting in with Alaska and the Colonel's friend group. The group participates in childish but funny pranks, late night smoking and drinking, and defying just about every rule the school sets for them. They push Miles to try new things and new people. From this push, there's a side character introduced as Miles' girlfriend named Laura. But as far as true love goes, Miles only ever genuinely has feelings for Alaska. However, she is rather vocal about having a boyfriend from the very beginning. This does little to stop Miles from feeling the way he does, and though Alaska jokingly plays along from time to time, the majority of the novel portrays these feelings as one-sided. This is true until the night before the climax of the story. The boarding school that the characters attend has a very strict no alcohol policy, but Alaska is famous for breaking this rule. There are numerous times throughout the novel that the main characters engage in drinking, especially when they are planning pranks. However, during one particular night of drinking, Alaska and Miles confess their feelings for each other in front of the Colonel. The exchange between them is heartwarming, and it definitely forces the reader to wish them a happily ever after. Hours later, after they all fall asleep, Alaska wakes the other two up in a frazzled state. She's screaming and crying that she needs to leave, that she is somewhere she has to be. Miles and the Colonel are confused by this behavior, but because they're all drunk, they sort of wave Alaska off. The next morning at an assembly, Miles and the Colonel receive news that Alaska was in a fatal car crash after she left. The two are understandably devastated and furious with themselves that they did not stop her from getting in the car. The rest of the book is centered around how her friends deal with both their grief over her death and the guilt that they let her leave in the first place. While fighting with this inner regret, they search for answers to Alaska's death, while fighting to keep her spirit alive. This sends a devastatingly important message about the risk of drunk driving and the effect that it has on everyone. Had Alaska just waited until the morning when she was sober and aware enough to make it to her destination, she would still be alive. The reason this book is banned in so many places is due to a singular scene in which the main character, Miles, engages in sexual activity with his girlfriend at the time, Laura. The scene is extremely monotoned, meant to send the message that the act did not have a lot of emotion attached to it. Critics and those who want the book to be banned typically argue that John Green could have left this particular scene out while still getting the message of the story across. I, however, disagree with this take. The entire novel is about love and loss, responsibility, and carelessness. The scene portrays the difference between physical and emotional attachment in a beautiful way. During his journey at the new boarding school, Miles thought that all he wanted was physical love, but his heart is captivated by his emotional attachment to Alaska. He tries to shove those feelings down with someone else, but it just isn't the same. The monotone sex scene between Miles and Laura is followed by a much more vividly written segment between Miles and the girl that he truly loves, Alaska. Even though the succeeding scene is not sexual in nature, the reader can feel all the emotion that is shared between Miles and Alaska during their unbeknownst last few moments together. This makes her death all the more devastating for everyone involved. I believe that the scene, while a bit explicit, sends an important message, and it shows the necessary difference between the kind of emotional attachment and a strong, passionate one, allowing us as readers to know just how strongly Miles felt about Alaska, even without a strong physical connection between them. However, with all that being said, I do think that, in order to understand the scene's message, or even truly appreciate the book as a whole, readers should be of at least high school level. Those who are seeking to ban the book from junior high and middle schools have every right to do so. The importance of John Green's words and metaphors would more than likely go over their head anyways, and they could just wait to read it when they reach the high school level. Regarding the book's banning at the high school level, though, I strongly disagree. Aside from the fact that teenagers should be allowed the freedom to choose what they can read, my thoughts tend to lean towards how many people this book could help. Drunk driving is such an excessive and genuine problem. For a lot of readers, what happens in the story is real to them. The grief and guilt that comes from losing someone you love is a heartbreaking thing, and I love that the book continues even after her death, signifying to readers that life does continue even though it may never be the same again. It's also a great message that the weekday warriors and the regular boarders put their differences aside to honor Alaska's memory. Grief is strong, and it has the power to bring people together. There's just so many lessons to be learned in this novel, and it's unfair for high school age students to be stripped of their right to read things that they relate to or are interested in. So much responsibility comes with growing up, and this book does a lot to show how quickly that responsibility can turn on you if you aren't careful. Banning this book from teenagers who are learning to balance freedom with responsibility is a huge mistake. This novel is so much more than the few pages that lean towards sexual intimacy. It's a strong testament to the power of change, friendship, and responsibility. Alaska believed that she was invincible, but nothing and no one is worth the risk of drunk driving. This message could reach so many people, and the more kids who understand that danger, the better. It doesn't just change one person's life when you make this decision. It impacts so many people, and in Alaska's case, entire communities. No matter how much her friends fought to keep her memory alive, their world was just not the same without Alaska Young. The importance behind this may be missed by younger kids, but it should absolutely be available to teenagers. It's also naive for instructors to think that high school students are not exposed to sexually explicit things daily, from the internet, movies, social media, etc. Instead of banning the novel, it should be used to its greatest capacity. Teach kids about the importance of meaningful relationships, how to grieve, that it's okay to ask for help, how terrible drunk driving can be. These are all great lessons that we could be teaching teenagers. From the very beginning, the chapters of the book are broken up into a timeline, counting down the days before and the days after Alaska's heart-wrenching death. This shows how great of an impact she was able to have in such a little time on our main character, and it's so important for teenagers to know how much responsibility they hold in their hands. This should not be their story. No one should have to grieve their kid or their friend. This book could save somebody's life, or at the very least, provide comfort to someone whose life has already been changed. I thankfully have never lost someone to drunk driving, but the story still pulled at my heartstrings like no other. It made me realize how quickly life can change, and I believe that everyone should have a chance to read this novel, and it's not okay to take that opportunity away from kids who may need to hear something from this story.